Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here today. Thank you for the organizers and the sponsors. I think it is a good sign that in these extremely difficult and tough times economically, that this conference is still going ahead. I'm going to talk today about CSR 2.0, and to say from the start that for me it is a metaphor for how corporate social responsibility needs to change if it's really going to make a difference in the world. But I think it's always a good idea to start by looking back a little bit. And for me, it's like two strands of DNA that have evolved over the last 40 or 50 years. And the first one is the DNA of responsibility. So in 1970, there was a great emphasis on shareholders. There was a famous article by Milton Friedman in the New York Times that was titled, The social responsibility of business is to make a profit. And that started to define the one end of the spectrum of belief on responsibility. And then in the so-called greed is good 80s, we had philanthropy making a comeback, lots of people with money to give away. And then the early 90s, after many of the remuneration scandals, corporate governance starting to emerge, first the Cadbury Code in the UK, later the King Code in South Africa, and many around the world. Stakeholder engagement really setting in around the 1990s, even though as a concept it emerged in the 80s. Then more talk about accountability, in other words, how you give account, how you measure your performance on social responsibility early in the 2000s. And I think a lot of the discussion now is more about responsible competitiveness. And you may be aware of some of the research that the organization Accountability has done on the Responsible Competitiveness Index. And what's interesting from that is that when you correlate that index with the economic responsibility or the economic competitiveness index, there is a correlation, so that more responsible economies also tend to be more economically competitive. The other strand of evolution, I believe, is the sustainability strand. And of course, these things have moved together and intertwined. But we saw the quality movement, especially from the 1970s, with Japan taking the lead, and then the health and safety emerging after many of the scandals. In Italy, for example, the Seveso disaster in 1979, I believe, and then Bhopal and many others. So health and safety taking a stronger role. Environmental management coming in with EMAS, the Eco Management and Auditing Scheme, then ISO 14001, and then the move towards integration of health, safety, and environment. And this was a progression I saw when I was running sustainability services in KPMG. We started out as environmental services, then we were environment, health, and safety, and then later sustainability services. And in fact, that's largely due to the man sitting at the front here, John Elkington, who introduced the idea of the triple bottom line of sustainability. In the 1990s, 1994, he first published on it, but probably took until the early 2000s before that took root in many companies around the world. And now again, I think a lot of the discussion is around sustainable markets, so clean tech, green tech, and so on. There's been one estimate that the value of responsible markets by 2050 will be $750 billion. So we've had these two strands of evolution, and then where we've got to on the social responsibility agenda is this new standard, ISO 26000, coming out this year. And it's interesting in a number of ways. The first is that I think the principles it's got and the core subjects at the very least expand the agenda so that nobody can anymore say that CSR is just about community involvement and development, or just about philanthropy. It needs to take into account all of these other areas: governance, human rights, labor, environment, fair operating practices, consumer issues, and so on. It's also interesting that the countries that voted against this standard were countries like China, India, Brazil, and some of the concerns around the standard were firstly the clause around international norms, and the fear that this standard might be used as a trade barrier. Now, I think it's actually quite unlikely, because the ISO organization has been very clear that this is not a certifiable standard. It's not like ISO 14001. And then they talk also about integration. So this is where I think we've got to, and I have my doubts about whether the standard will revolutionize the world. I've seen many standards come and go, and in fact, that it's not certifiable makes me think that it may not be taken too seriously. So this is where we've got to. What does that mean for CSR? Well, in my view, it means that we should bury CSR. I think it's time that we should kill it off and look for something new. This is, in fact, last year when I was launching CSR International, I held a funeral service in London. That's me with a coffin, burying CSR theatrically, and I had a eulogy, which I read. But I think there is a version of CSR that is still being practiced and, in fact, being adopted all over the world, especially in developing countries, that is very limited and that, in my view, has added in some ways more to the problem than to the solution. And I think that's because CSR suffers from three curses, and I call them the incremental, peripheral and uneconomic curses. And we need something new, which I'm calling CSR 2.0, based on certain principles if we're really going to make progress. So let's look through those. What do I mean by the incremental curse? Well, I just put ISO 14001 up here because it's an example of an incremental standard. It's based on the quality cycle of continuous improvement, and without a doubt, it has resulted in many companies making improvements, sometimes fairly significant improvements. And yet I think it's important that we stand back and we look at the state of the world. And if you look at virtually every indicator on the social, environmental, ethical, and now even economic performance, many of those indicators are still heading in the wrong direction. Whether you look at biodiversity loss, whether you look at issues of corruption and transparency, whether you look at the gap between rich and poor. These are not problems that over the same period that CSR has got stronger, we have actually solved. In fact, we seem to be going backwards on many issues. So to me, that means something is broken. In this approach, the speed and scale that incremental change brings about isn't up to the challenge of the problems that we face. The second curse is the peripheral CSR curse, and in fact, I used the slide even before the BP oil spill, but I think the message is even more powerful now. And this is just to illustrate. It's actually an advert put together by Greenpeace. After BP changed its name to Beyond Petroleum, they ran these adverts in the UK and the USA. But the small print was different. In the UK, they said, work out your carbon footprint. It's a start. And in the US, they said, we're investing $15 billion in new oil and gas in the Gulf of Mexico. It's a start. So these completely contradictory messages, and it's no wonder that the public is saying, for companies like BP, and it's not only BP, but CSR has done nothing to fundamentally change their strategy. They're still very much an oil and gas company. They haven't gone beyond petroleum. And so this is the way in which CSR has a very limited impact. And it's because of a few reasons. One, it normally sits in a public relations department or perhaps an HR or a marketing department and never really gets integrated into all the departments of the company. The second thing, of course, is it often doesn't get beyond the very large companies in any country. If you're lucky, it's the top 100. But what about the tens of thousands, even the millions of other companies, and what about the SMEs? They're not really talking or practicing CSR. So it's remained, in my view, fairly peripheral, even though we hear a lot about it in the media. The third curse, which is almost sacrilege in forums like this, but is to suggest that CSR is by and large uneconomic. And I use here just an illustration. This is the VISSER fund in the US, which only invests in the so-called sin industries like tobacco, alcohol, gambling, arms and ammunition. And the blue line is how well they're doing. They're completely outperforming the market. including the CSR index, which is the orange line. So it's not to say that in certain instances where you can use things like eco-efficiency, cost savings can be made. It's not to say that in the long term, being good to society isn't good for your business. But actually, in the short-term markets in most of the world, the economy does not systematically reward sustainable and responsible behavior. And those that get away with less sustainable and less responsible don't get punished at anything like the level that would make a significant difference to their business. So I think this is the third reason why CSR has failed, at least in the West. And so like yourselves, I got thinking about this analogy of Web 1.0 and CSR 1.0. But for me, it is a metaphor. So what was it about Web 1.0? Well, of course, it was quite small. 46 million users by 1996, and very much one-way traffic. So it was about especially companies putting their content online once they got the hang of it and telling the world how wonderful they are. And that rings some certain bells with CSR and a lot of the CSR publishing and reporting and media campaigns that we've seen in the old version of CSR. I happen to put a book up here as an illustration of where I think the CSR agenda is limited. It's a book called Philanthrocapitalism, which I think is a disaster of an idea. The idea, as the subtext says, that the rich can save the world, I think is approaching this problem completely in the wrong way. And I blogged about this, and the authors of the book weren't particularly happy, so they blogged back in rather uncomplimentary terms. But I haven't really changed my mind. I don't think this is the way to solve the world's problems. So there were innovators in the Web 1.0 space. Netscape, I think, was quite an innovator. But then eventually the big companies like Microsoft got in and started to standardize everything, hardware and software. And in the same way, I think we've seen, even though there were early innovators in the CSR and the sustainability space, we've seen it go through a cycle now of standardization. In fact, in one of the books that I've done, The A to Z of Corporate Social Responsibility, there are over 100 CSR codes and standards that we profile in that book. So I'm hoping that ISO 26000 is the last one, that we've done the international standardization trend, and it's only got us so far. But then, of course, Web 2.0 is quite different. Of course, the first thing is that it went to scale, so more than 1 billion users by 2006. More importantly, though, it became a two-way interactive space. So we hear things like collective intelligence, like user-generated content. And as an illustration of where CSR began to get hold of this concept, I put up the book by Ray Anderson, the founder and CEO of Interface, the carpet manufacturer, because they were one of the first to really grasp this idea that you have to fundamentally change the business model if you're going to be sustainable. So when we get inspiration from CSR, from Web 2.0, we start to hear about things like collective intelligence, collaborative networks, social media, which we'll talk a bit more about today, knowledge syndication, beta testing. These are all very good analogies of what I believe needs to happen in the CSR space, where we talk more about global commons, innovative partnerships, stakeholder involvement and panels, real-time reporting. You know, if there's an explosion in the middle of the night in a factory in my neighborhood, I don't want to wait 2 years to read about that in a CSR report. I want real online data that I can see what's going on. The trend towards social enterprise is part of this, and recognizing that actually, unless we change the business model, we'll just be doing more of the same. So I believe that the new model, the CSR 2.0 model, we can test against 5 principles. And even ISO 26000, if it gets used, I believe we can test against these principles. So the first one is creativity. I don't know if you recognize these products for what they have in common. We've got a torch there and a radio and a laptop. And what they have in common is that none of them are connected to electricity. They're not connected to the grid, and they don't use batteries. So it's using wind-up technology, and they're products invented by a company called Freeplay. This is because in a continent like Africa, people aren't connected to the grid. They have to walk a long way if they want to get batteries, and they probably run out by the time they get back, and they're very expensive. So it's an example of a set of products that are designed for a social solution. I've just come back from India a few weeks ago, and there's some very inspiring work going on there. There's a company called A Little World, which is now using biometric scanners together with cell phones to create rural microbanks. And the microbank consists of just one person, and they've just got one mobile phone and one biometric scanner. A rural person who doesn't have to have an education, doesn't have to have an ID card, can come and have their fingerprints scanned, record their voice on the mobile phone, and that gets sent through automatically to Mumbai, and their basic bank account is set up. So I think creativity is something that we need. And of course, many of the people that are starting to push this, it's not a new idea, but when we get people like Klaus Schwab, founder of the World Economic Forum, and Jeff Skoll, founder of eBay, supporting this principle, then we start to see it going to scale. And it's something that John Elkington, a space that he's moved into very strongly as well. I like the way that Jeff Skoll sort of defines social enterprise. He says it's where a lot of good comes from a little good. In other words, where the positive social returns vastly exceed the amount of time and money invested. Well, let's look at another example. I think there's a good case to be made that Apple may be one of the most creative companies in the world, but the question is how much of that creativity is directed towards solving our social and environmental problems. I would argue at the moment not much. Contrast that to what Vodafone is doing in Kenya, where 80% of the population doesn't have access to banking services. Not only that, more money comes into Kenya through remittances from families living abroad than through development aid. And every time that money comes in, they pay a huge percentage to Western Union. So Vodafone, together with their company there called Safaricom, invented a technology where people can transfer money by text. Suddenly you've included the whole population in financial services, you've cut out a lot of the corruption, and you've cut out the agency fees. The second principle, I believe, and one where CSR has really failed, is the principle of scalability. So if we look at some innovative areas like the Ethical Trading Initiative or Tradecraft in the UK, I mean, these have made some strides from the early days, but never really reached the scalability in terms of ethical consumerism in any of the markets, Western markets. But what happens when Lee Scott, then CEO of Walmart, after Hurricane Katrina, sees what his employees do, namely that they throw open the doors and ask people just to take the products because this is a crisis? Well, he could have fired them, of course, but what he did do is he seemed to have a bit of a Damascus experience and to realize that Walmart could have a real positive impact in the world. And at least on the environmental agenda, started quite a serious reform program within Walmart. And so when Walmart decides, as they did, that all cotton will be organic, all fish will be MSC certified to be sustainable, the impact down the supply chains of the world, one of the biggest companies, is incredible. And suddenly you've got these ethical products going to scale. That's a scalability effect. Let's look at another example. I don't know how many people in the room, if I ask the question, drive a Toyota Prius? Anybody? Me neither. And one of the reasons, I think it's a wonderful product, but it's also a premium product, and at the moment is not something that is going to scale. Contrast that with Tata in India, that decides to make a car for $2,500 that is accessible to everyone and gives mobility to people in India. Now, I think it's a different debate about what happens when 1 billion Indians all drive a car. I think there is an ethical issue about giving people access to certain options. Of course, in the finance industry, we've seen it as well. For many years, the big banks tried to get into the poor markets in terms of loans, and not very successfully. And so many people living in low-income areas were subject to the loan sharking, until Muhammad Yunus in 1976, after famine in Bangladesh, started the Grameen Bank. And now microfinance has gone to scale all over the world as an international movement. So creativity, scalability, and the third principle, I believe, is responsiveness. Now, in the early 90s, I believe it was, when climate change was just starting to become a very serious issue, the oil companies of the world got into something called the Global Climate Coalition. And it wasn't just Exxon, it was many of the big oil companies. And the purpose of that group was to undermine the science of climate change and to undermine the Kyoto Protocol, the international agreement. That's quite a different, quite an unresponsive approach compared to a group like the Corporate Leaders Group on Climate Change, which happens to be something at Cambridge University that we facilitate. And this is a group of around 30 CEOs that are actively lobbying for more legislation on climate change, for a global deal and a global carbon price on carbon. And why would they do that? Well, they're trying to break the deadlock where governments are saying, we can't move because you will lobby against us, and business is saying, well, we can't move because we need a stable investment horizon, and we can't change to the new technologies unless we have that long-term policy certainty. So that's a far more responsive approach. Or look at the WTO with their trade-related intellectual property rights and some of the ways that I believe that's been abused. So in 2001, the pharmaceutical companies of the world took the South African government to court because the government was trying to offer generic HIV and AIDS drugs at a low cost to the society. Now, eventually they dropped that court case because there was so much resistance and protest all around the world. But it wasn't a very responsive approach initially of the pharmaceutical industry. Contrast that to something like the WBCSD Eco-Patent Commons, where if you've got a technology or a process or an innovation that you believe can add to the solutions around environmental issues, you can put it into this commons where everybody has access to it. Now, I don't know how many people have seen Super Size Me in the room. Has anybody seen the... So many of you, I think, this is the more popular story around McDonald's where Morgan Spurlock ate McDonald's food for 30 days, breakfast, lunch, and supper. And, of course, he got rather unwell. He got rather overweight. He had liver dysfunction. He had sexual dysfunction. And in fact, when I tell this story, when I was telling it in Kenya, they said, well, maybe that's one of our solutions. We've got a population problem here. So if we feed everyone McDonald's, it'll solve that problem. But, of course, they were joking. The story that many people don't know is in 1986, there was a small NGO in London that wrote a pamphlet called Everything That's Wrong with McDonald's That They Don't Want You to Know. And McDonald's could have sat down with them and said, we disagree with some of your facts. But in fact, what they did is they took them to court and they sued them for libel. And it turned into the longest-running court case in British history, 313 days. And what started out as 6 pages turned into 40,000 pages of evidence, all made public. So public relations disaster for McDonald's. The NGO in the end paid nothing. McDonald's paid £10 million in legal fees. So that's a very unresponsive approach. And of course, they've changed a lot since then. By contrast, you look at a company like Rio Tinto, which digs very big holes in the ground for a living, and you would think they would be the largest enemy for the conservation organizations. They realize that, so instead they go to the World Conservation Union and say, let's get into a partnership and try and work out the solutions on biodiversity together. We're not going to stop digging holes in the ground. You're not going to stop being concerned about biodiversity, and so let's try and work this out together. So creativity, scalability, and responsiveness. The fourth principle is glocality, and I promise I didn't make this word up, somebody else did. In fact, it's meant to be based on a Japanese concept and simply means think global, act local, as a concept I'm sure you're familiar with. And just to illustrate the point, if you're moving in the academic space, you may be familiar with Archie Carroll, a US academic, who in 1979 came up with a definition for CSR, illustrated as a pyramid, where he said it's the economic, legal, ethical, and philanthropic responsibilities of companies. And that for all this time has persisted as a global definition of CSR, partly because Archie Carroll's very good at repeating himself, but also because there's something in about it that it makes sense. But when I visited Guatemala and the sugar plantations there, and I asked them what their model of CSR is, they came up with a different pyramid. And they said, yes, economic responsibility, but then it's the responsibility to the families of our employees, then to the community, and then to engage with policy. Now, of course, this is not more or less right. I think for Guatemala, this is absolutely what they should be doing, is coming up with their own model that is still based on international principles, but adapted to local conditions. To take another example, when I was with KPMG, I did some work with a global aluminium company, and they had a smelter which in Mozambique, and they got rated on an index in Europe for CSR, and they performed quite badly, and they tried to understand why that was. And it turned out that the index in Europe was very concerned about eco-efficiency, about energy issues and climate change, as they still are. But for this company, they're right next to South Africa with some of the cheapest electricity in the world. So that wasn't their most pressing issue. What was, in fact, that was in Mozambique, half of their employees were dying of malaria. So they had a very strong malaria prevention program, a very effective one, but of course they got no credit for that on the international CSR index. It's an example of how they were using international principles but adapting them locally, and they were absolutely right. So sometimes, let's say, Western environmental standards may be less appropriate in a certain area than something like the Millennium Development Goals.